No one in Hollow Creek expected John Mallory to come back, not from the coma, not from the shame, and certainly not from the years of whispered curses that followed his name. And yet here he was, breathing under the dull hum of a hospital ventilator, as if death itself had been put on hold for something, or someone. In this town, people remembered sins longer than they remembered birthdays. They also remembered skin color faster than they remembered kindness. John had been the kind of man people nodded to on the street, but didn't invite over for supper. Not because he was unfriendly. Lord knew he'd given more hay bales to neighbors than he kept for himself, but because of the way his past tangled with the present, especially that day 5 years ago when a black boy appeared on his farm, barefoot, bruised, and terrified. The boy's name was Elijah. Back then, John hadn't thought twice about it. He saw danger in the boy's eyes, something raw and urgent. So, he did what a man should do. He brought him inside, gave him food, and hid him until it was safe. The sheriff had asked questions. John had lied through his teeth. That lie had cost him friendships, invitations to Sunday service, and in some unspoken way, his place in Hollow Creek. A week after Elijah disappeared into foster care, John collapsed in his field. Doctors called it a massive stroke. His body lay there for hours before someone found him. By then, his mind had already slipped deep into darkness. 5 years. That's how long he'd been locked away inside himself. 5 winters without snow on his skin. 5 harvests without the feel of wheat between his fingers. 5 years of silence. Until tonight. The sun had already fallen behind the wheat fields when Elijah came back. He was taller now, his face sharper, but still carrying the same cautious eyes. He didn't tell anyone he was coming. He just walked into Hollow Creek General Hospital with a cardboard box under his arm. Nurse Betty had frowned at him. "Visiting hours are over, kid." "I'm not here to visit," Elijah said, his voice steady. "I'm here to wake him up." It was such a strange thing to say that Betty didn't know whether to laugh or call security. In the end, she just let him through. Hollow Creek had learned, over the years, that Elijah's kind of stubborn didn't bend easy. Inside room 12, the air was stale with disinfectant and the faint scent of earth that somehow clung to John's skin. The machines beeped steadily. His chest rose and fell in small, practiced movements that no longer looked like life. Elijah placed the cardboard box on the chair, then walked to the bedside. He stared at John for a long time, his hand twitching like he was afraid to touch him. Then, slowly, he reached into the box and pulled out a small wooden tractor. The paint had faded, but the carving was unmistakable. It was the toy John had given him the night he first came to the farm. He set the tractor on the bedside table. "Hey, Mr. Mallory," Elijah whispered. "It's me." His voice cracked at the edges, but he pushed on. "I'm not supposed to be here. My foster mom doesn't even know I left. But I heard you were still asleep. I couldn't let it stay like that." Outside, wind moved through the wheat like an invisible tide. "I don't know if you can hear me," Elijah said, his fingers curling into fists, "but I need you to know something. You saved me, when no one else would. You didn't care what I looked like, where I came from, or what people would say. You just did it. And because of you, I'm still here. I'm not running anymore." The boy's hand trembled as he reached for John's. And then against every rule of medicine, reason, and expectation, John's fingers twitched. It was small, almost imperceptible, but Elijah froze, his breath catching like a startled animal. "Mr. Mallory?" The heart monitor picked up speed. Betty, still at the nurse's station, glanced at the monitor's sudden beeping and nearly dropped her clipboard. By the time she rushed in, John's lips were moving. Elijah leaned closer, his ear almost touching the farmer's dry, cracked mouth. "Boy," John rasped, voice like gravel. "You came back." Betty gasped. "My God, he's waking up." John's eyes fluttered open, not all the way, but enough to catch the dim yellow light above him and the shape of the boy's face. And for the first time in half a decade, the farmer's chest rose in something that wasn't just breathing, it was relief. The news spread faster than wildfire. In a town where people still crossed the street to avoid each other based on skin tone, the story of the white farmer waking up to a black boy's touch stirred something restless in the air. Some called it a miracle. Others called it nonsense. But no one could deny that it had happened. John was weak, barely able to lift his hand without help. But every day after, Elijah came back. Sometimes they talked. Sometimes they just sat in silence. letting the beeping machines and rustling wheat outside fill the space. Not everyone liked it. By the third day, Sheriff Coleman showed up, hat in hand, pretending his visit was just checking in. His eyes lingered on Elijah a second too long. "Didn't expect to see you back here, son," he said, his voice dripping with politeness that didn't match his eyes. Elijah didn't flinch. "Didn't expect to be welcome," he replied. Coleman's mouth twitched. "Just make sure you're not causing trouble." When he left, John's eyes narrowed. "That man still breathing?" he asked. "Yeah," Elijah said. "Why?" John gave a slow, tired smile. "Guess God ain't done punishing him yet." They both laughed, quietly, like conspirators. It was strange waking up to a world that had kept moving without him. Farms had changed hands. The old diner was gone. Some faces were missing from church pews, replaced by new ones who didn't know his name. But the biggest change wasn't the buildings or the people. It was the way the air felt heavier, like the tension between races had thickened over the years. And yet here he was, living proof that sometimes the walls cracked, even if just for a moment. One evening, a week after waking, John asked Elijah about the wooden tractor. "You kept it all this time?" he asked. Elijah nodded. It was the only thing that felt safe. John swallowed hard. "You're a stubborn one, boy." "So are you," Elijah said with a grin. Outside, the wheat swayed in the wind, the same as it had 5 years ago. But inside room 12, something had shifted, something bigger than the Coma, bigger than Hollow Creek, and bigger than the years they'd lost. Neither of them said it out loud, but they both knew. This was just the beginning. Elijah wasn't used to staying in one place for long. In his life, home was always a temporary word, something you said to strangers when they asked, but didn't mean in your heart. Yet every day he came back to room 12, and every day he felt that strange pull, like the hospital was the only place in Hollow Creek where the air didn't judge him. The town, on the other hand, was starting to notice. On his 5th visit, Elijah left the hospital just as the sun was sinking, a blood-orange smear over the horizon. The street was nearly empty, but he felt eyes on him, Simeon's gaze lingering too long from across the road. A man in a truck slowed as he passed, the engine growling low, and though Elijah didn't recognize the face, he knew the expression. It was the same look he'd seen on strangers years ago when they realized a black boy was walking alone through a white town. He kept walking, his fists deep in his hoodie pocket, the wooden tractor pressing against his palm. Back in the hospital, John was awake enough now to ask questions, though Betty said he still needed rest. He ignored her warnings. "Boy," John said the next morning, "what's going on out there? Folks treating you right?" Elijah hesitated. "Some are. Some. Not so much." John's jaw tightened. That's the trouble with Hollow Creek. They remember what they want to remember, and they forget the rest. "Like what you did for me?" Elijah asked. "Exactly like that." John's mind was sharp, even if his body lagged behind. Every word Elijah spoke seemed to feed something in him, not just his will to live, but his will to fight. 3 days later, a letter came. It was slipped under John's hospital door while Elijah was gone. The handwriting was rough, hurried. Betty brought it in without comment, but her face was pale. John opened it with shaky hands. The message was short. "You should have stayed asleep. You're bringing trouble back with you." When Elijah returned that afternoon, John didn't tell him right away. He just folded the note and slid it under his pillow. He wasn't ready not yet to lay that burden on the boy. But the town wasn't subtle. Rumors started curling through the diner, the post office, and the church pews. Some said Elijah was trouble. Others whispered about unfinished business from the day John took him in. The past, it seemed, was clawing its way to the surface. It all came to a head on a rainy Thursday. Elijah walked into the hospital with his hoodie dripping, eyes shadowed, and when John asked what happened, he wouldn't answer. Finally, after a long silence, Elijah muttered, "They called me a thief." "Who?" John's voice was sharp now, all traces of weakness gone. "Doesn't matter. I didn't take anything." "But he stopped, swallowing hard. "It's the same as before. Doesn't matter what I do. Some people will always see me as what they think I am." John stared at him for a long time, then said quietly, "You ever hear the story about the dog and the snake?" Elijah shook his head. "There's this old farmer," John began, "and he finds a snake half frozen in the snow, picks it up, puts it by the fire, saves its life. Soon as the snake warms up, it bites him. And when the farmer asks why, the snake says, You knew what I was when you picked me up. Elijah frowned. What's that supposed to mean? John leaned back. It means some folks got poison in them, boy. And it don't matter how kind you are, they'll still bite you. But here's the thing. You don't stop being who you are because of them. Otherwise, they win. For the first time that day, Elijah's shoulders eased. But the peace didn't last. That night, while John slept, Elijah wandered outside the hospital to clear his head. The rain had stopped, leaving the air thick and cold. He was halfway down the block when he heard footsteps behind him. Hey boy, a voice called. He turned to see two men, both older, one wearing a camo jacket, the other with a baseball cap pulled low. You the one hanging around Mallory? The man in the cap asked. Elijah didn't answer. Thought so, the man in the camo jacket said. You're bringing your kind of trouble back to this town. Don't. When Elijah didn't move, the man stepped closer. You think we forgot? We know why you were on his farm. And it ain't the story you've been telling. Elijah's fists clenched, but he didn't speak. He knew this game words meant to corner him, to make him fight, so they could say he started it. Go home, boy, the man in the cap said. Wherever that is. They walked off, but the threat hung in the air like smoke. Elijah didn't tell John, not that night, not the next day. But John saw it anyway. The boy's eyes were different now, sharper at the edges. On Sunday, Pastor Green stopped by the hospital. He was a tall, lean man with a voice like velvet, but his visit felt more like a warning than a blessing. We're all glad you're back, John, he said, resting a hand on the farmer's shoulder. But some folks, they're worried. The past was buried for a reason. John's gaze was steady. Some things don't deserve to be buried. Green's eyes flicked toward Elijah. Just remember who pays the price when the digging starts. When he left, Elijah finally asked, what did they mean? The past was buried. John sighed. There's more to that night than you know. More than I ever told you. Elijah leaned forward. Tell me. John hesitated, the weight of years pressing down on him. You came to my farm because someone was chasing you. I didn't ask who, because I could see you didn't want to say. But the truth is, I knew. I knew exactly who it was. And I knew what they'd do if they found you. Elijah's stomach tightened. Who? John's voice was low now. Men in this town. Men who've worn badges, and men who've burned crosses. Same kind of men that gave me that note under my pillow. The room was silent except for the beeping monitor. You saved me, Elijah said. And it cost you everything. John's eyes softened. It was worth it. I'd do it again. But now, boy, it's your turn to decide if you're gonna run. Or stand. That night, Elijah didn't sleep. He sat in the hospital chair, staring out at the dark wheat fields, the tractor still on the table beside John's bed. Somewhere deep inside, a decision was forming, not just about staying in Hollow Creek, but about facing what had chased him all those years ago. The storm was coming. He could feel it. And this time, he wasn't going to face it alone. 3 nights later, the storm Elijah had felt in his bones arrived. It didn't start with thunder or lightning. It started with a sound too small for anyone else to notice: gravel crunching under tires outside Hollow Creek General Hospital just past midnight. The streets were empty, but the engine idled for a long time before cutting off. Inside room 12, John was asleep, his breathing slow and steady. Elijah sat in the chair by the window, staring into the dark wheat fields beyond. That's when he saw them. 2 figures stepped out of the truck, both in heavy jackets, their faces shadowed by the brim of their caps. They didn't come toward the hospital's main entrance. They moved along the side, toward the fire door at the far end of the hall. Elijah's stomach dropped. He didn't have to guess who they were. He was already on his feet when the first bang echoed down the corridor, the fire door slamming open. The sound was sharp, hollow, like a gunshot swallowed by the building. John stirred. What in? Stay here, Elijah whispered, his voice tight. Like hell, John said, trying to push himself upright, but the 4 tugged at his arm and pain flared across his face. Elijah stepped into the hallway just as the 2 men came into view. Evening, boy, the taller one said, his voice oily and too casual. We just came to talk. Elijah didn't move. You've got nothing to say to me. The shorter man grinned, revealing the gap between his teeth. Sure we do. We've been thinking about old times. Thought maybe you had too. From behind Elijah, John's voice cut in, ragged but loud enough to carry. You're trespassing. The taller man's smile faded. Mallory, still playing hero, still playing coward? John shot back. The gap-toothed man's grin twisted into something mean. You should have stayed asleep. Before Elijah could speak, the taller man stepped forward, crowding the space between them. We don't want trouble, he said. But trouble's what happens when you dig up the past. You and your little reunion here? Not good for the town. John's eyes locked on Elijah's. Don't listen to a damn word they say. The men ignored him. You think people forgot what you did? Who you were running from? We can make sure everyone remembers. The air felt thick, pressing in on all sides. You already tried to ruin him once, Elijah said, his voice shaking with anger. And it didn't work. You're not going to do it again. The taller man's jaw tightened. Careful, boy. The next few seconds blurred. The gap-toothed man shoved Elijah's shoulder, and Elijah shoved back harder than he meant to. The man stumbled, hit the wall, and snarled like an animal. His hand went for something in his jacket. Stop! John's voice cracked through the hallway. Don't you dare! But the shorter man had already pulled a knife. It wasn't big, but in the fluorescent hospital light, the blade looked like liquid fire. Elijah didn't think moved. Years of running had taught him one thing. When danger came, you couldn't freeze. He grabbed the man's wrist and shoved it upward, the knife scraping the wall. The taller man lunged to grab him, but John, frail, pale, barely able to stand, had hauled himself halfway out of the bed and yanked the four-stand sideways. The metal pole crashed into the taller man's knees, sending him down with a yell. The shorter one jerked his wrist free and slashed out wildly. The blade caught Elijah's arm, a quick, hot sting, but before the man could strike again, Nurse Betty's voice shrieked from the end of the hall. What the hell is going on here? Footsteps thundered. The men froze, the taller one scrambling to his feet. This ain't over, he spat, his eyes flicking between Elijah and John. Then they bolted, disappearing through the fire door before hospital security could arrive. The hallway fell into a heavy silence broken only by Elijah's breathing. Betty rushed to him. You're bleeding. I'm fine, Elijah said, though his arm burned where the knife had grazed him. John was still half out of the bed, gripping the four-stand like a weapon. Find my ass, he muttered. Get him patched up. When the nurse left to grab supplies, Elijah sank into the chair again, his body trembling. They're not going to stop, are they? John's eyes were steady. No, not until someone makes them. That someone's not me, Elijah said quickly. I'm just a kid. John's voice hardened. You're not just anything. You're the only person in this damn town who's not afraid to be seen with me. That counts for something. The cut on Elijah's arm was shallow, but it left a smear of blood on his sleeve that wouldn't wash out. It felt like a mark of warning. The next morning, Sheriff Coleman came by. He claimed he'd heard about a disturbance in the hospital, but his questions were slow, measured, as if he already knew the answers. You recognize the men? He asked Elijah. No, Elijah lied. Coleman's gaze lingered. Sometimes it's easier to forget things, son, for your own good. When he left, John's voice was a low growl. That man's been protecting them for years. They're not going to stop, Elijah repeated. No, John said. So we don't wait for them. We bring the truth out before they do. Over the next few days, they pieced it together. The men who'd chased Elijah years ago had been looking for more than a runaway boy. They'd been looking for silence. Elijah had seen something back when he lived with his aunt in the next county over. A beating behind the old feed store. The kind that doesn't end until the target stops moving. The victim had been a black man no one in town ever named again. The attackers had been men with friends in uniforms. When Elijah ran, they'd called him a liar. Said he'd stolen from the feed store, made up a story to cover it. And then he disappeared until the night he landed on John Mallory's farm. You understand, John said one morning. If you tell this, it won't just be your fight. It'll be mine too. You sure you want that? Elijah asked. John smiled faintly. Boy, I already had it. They didn't have a perfect plan, but they had one advantage. No one in town thought John was strong enough to leave the hospital. So, 2 nights later, he did. Betty helped, though she didn't say why. She just shook her head and muttered, Don't make me regret this, as she wheeled John out the side door to Elijah's borrowed pickup truck. They drove to the old community hall on the edge of town, where a local reporter from the county paper was waiting. Her name was Sandra Lee, and she wasn't from Hollow Creek, meaning she didn't have loyalties here. For an hour, Elijah told everything. The feed store, the attack, the men who'd come for him. John filled in the rest. The night Elijah arrived, the threats, the letter under his pillow. Sandra wrote fast, her pen scratching like fire. When they finished, she said quietly, "If I run this, you'll both have targets on your backs." John's voice was iron. "Run it anyway." They drove back to the hospital in silence, the wheat fields glowing pale under the moon. Elijah glanced at John, who was leaning back with his eyes closed, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "What?" Elijah asked. John didn't open his eyes. "Feels good to stand up, even if you're sitting down." The article dropped on a Thursday morning. Sandra Lee hadn't pulled any punches. A headline stretched bold across the county paper. "Black boy's testimony reopens unsolved hate crime, local men implicated by noon." Hollow Creek was split right down the middle. At the diner, people whispered over coffee. In the hardware store, someone slammed the paper onto the counter hard enough to knock over a display. The sheriff's office had its blinds drawn. By 2 o'clock, the threat started. Betty intercepted the first phone call to John's room. No name. Just a voice dripping with venom. "You should have kept your mouth shut." Elijah got it worse. A rock through the window of his foster home. The word liars spray painted across the side of the pickup. "Guess that means they believe us," John said grimly when he saw the truck. But the real storm hit that night. The hospital was quieter than usual, most of the lights dimmed. Elijah had stayed late, knowing his foster parents didn't want the trouble he brought with him. He was halfway down the hall to room 12 when he heard a muffled crash from John's room. He ran. The door was half open. Inside, the taller man from before was leaning over John's bed, one hand clamped around the farmer's throat. The gap-toothed man stood by the window, watching. "You think you can ruin us?" the taller one hissed. "You think anyone's gonna believe a washed-up farmer and a street rat?" John's face was red, his hands gripping the man's arm, but his voice came out steady. "They already do." The man's eyes flashed, and he pressed harder. That was when Elijah moved. He didn't stop to measure the risk. He grabbed the wooden tractor from the bedside table and swung it hard. The crack of wood against bone echoed in the small room. The taller man staggered back, cursing. John sucked in a desperate breath. The gap-toothed man lunged for Elijah, but this time, Elijah didn't back away. He ducked under the man's arm and shoved him hard toward the window. The commotion brought Betty running, shouting for security. The two men bolted, disappearing into the night before anyone could grab them. When it was over, John was propped up in bed, pale but breathing. Elijah stood by the window, chest heaving, the wooden tractor still in his hand. "You all right?" Elijah asked. John's smile was slow, tired. "You hit like a man who's done running." The police came, but Coleman handled the questions with an almost bored tone. They took statements, promised to look into it, and left without making any arrests. By the next morning, though, the story had already grown teeth. Sandra's follow-up article named the two attackers both linked to the old feed store incident. The sheriff's office tried to deny involvement, but the pressure from outside the county was building. Reporters started showing up, not from the local paper, but from bigger outlets, places that didn't care about Hollow Creek's unspoken rules. Cameras rolled in front of the hospital. The story was out, and no one could bury it again. For the first time in years, Elijah walked through town without lowering his eyes. Not everyone met his gaze kindly, but enough people did for him to notice. On Sunday, Pastor Green came to the hospital again. This time, his words were quieter. "Never thought I'd see the day this town faced what it's done," he said to John. John's reply was simple. "It's not facing it yet, but it's looking at it. That's a start." 2 weeks later, arrests were made. Not just for the attack on John and Elijah, but for the old hate crime Elijah had witnessed. Coleman was forced to resign. The county, under pressure from the glare of statewide media, announced a full review of unsolved racial violence cases. It didn't fix everything. The wheat fields still whispered with the same wind, the church still held the same hymns, and some neighbors still crossed the street when Elijah walked by. But it was a crack in the wall. And cracks, John liked to say, let the light in. The night before John was discharged, Elijah came to his room, carrying something wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" John asked. "Open it." Inside was a new wooden tractor, carved by Elijah himself. It was rough in places, the paint uneven, but the wheels turned smooth. "You're not the only one who can make something worth keeping," Elijah said with a shy grin. John's hands closed around it. For a long time, he didn't speak. Then he said, "When I first gave you that old tractor, I didn't know if I'd ever see you again. Now I'm glad as hell I did. Elijah's voice was quiet. Me too. They sat there a while, the hum of the hospital around them, the wheat fields swaying under the moonlight outside. The coma had stolen 5 years from John Mallory, but it had given him something back, to a second chance. And for Elijah, who'd spent his life running, it gave him a reason to stop. When John finally walked out of Hollow Creek General, Elijah was at his side. They stepped into the sunlight together, not as a farmer and a runaway, not as a white man and a black boy, but as two people who had seen the worst of this town and chosen not to be broken by it. The road ahead wasn't easy, but neither of them had ever asked for easy. What they had now was better truth, a little hope, and the unshakable knowledge that the touch of a hand, offered without prejudice, could bring someone back to life. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.